weaponize that into. In fact, Democrats are still getting stick with those kind.
So, Joshua, is the Democratic Party evolving in sort of dialing back the more progressive stances that they have in response to this election?
I don't think I can say with certainty that that's exactly what they're doing. I think it's definitely a consideration. I think anybody who's saying it's not a consideration is probably not telling the full truth, right? The honest truth is that the American people spoke a couple of days ago, and it could be read as folks thinking that Democrats have moved a little bit too far on the left on some of these issues, right? Depends on which one you're looking at in particular. But I do think that is a part of the consideration of where they'll be moving forward because of the magnitude of the loss that Democrats just suffered.
Amanda, not that you want to strategize for the Democratic Party, but just for argument's sake, what traditional values do you think the Democratic Party might be able to champion that would resonate with Americans?
So I think that today, if I'm not mistaken, AOC removed her pronouns from her X profile. So I think that may be a start in the right direction of really, putting aside these things that are trying to create variations among us. If people have, that as a preference, that's fine. But, making it so that we go back to kind of being a traditional, in the sense of, defunding the police is a perfect example. When in America's history have we ever said we should defund the police? Not until the last 3 or 4 years. So if we want to protect our law enforcement, we need to talk about that. We need to be bold about it. Fracking, that is one thing that Kamala Harris flip-flopped on quite a bit. Those are jobs. Those are jobs in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, that are important, but also energy prices are important to people. I live in Florida. Our utilities are very expensive. People fear opening up their utility bills. And so that is something that the Democratic Party needs to see not as bad environment, but good for the economy. So coming into where most Americans are, whether they're independent, Democrat, or Republican, people want relief. The economy and poverty are the top issues along with the border. You can't ignore these things. You can't neglect these things. And I think Van Jones really said it well. He said that, on these Zoom calls, it's so uncomfortable talking with other Democrats because we don't know where we're going from here. And I think what they should do is to take a look at how this election went, how Democrats in urban areas that typically go strongly for Democrats that didn't go as strongly, what were the important issues?
Joshua, I'll give you a chance to respond.
I'm hesitant I like agreeing with my colleagues across the aisle. I agree with some of what was just said. I also think the majority of progressive issues on the left are actually much more popular than the conservative issues, right? I think a lot of times Democrats are struggling with a packaging issue, right? We saw that even with something like the child tax credit, when it's packaged as something that helps and is a paternalistic government giving to people who need. We see middle-class people who would utilize something like that the most reject it, in public opinion polls. You take that same child tax credit and you package it as something that allows an autonomous person to go back to work and provide for their family, it increases in popularity, right? So a lot of what Democrats are dealing with, I think, is more of a messaging issue, but messaging issues get in the way of governing, and I will never back away from that being true. So I think it's a lot more of where they can move on how they talk about the things that they're offering the American people.
Fetterman was also asked whether there are any issues that he could work on with Trump. He responded, quote, sure, protecting the American steel industry, being very unapologetically pro-Israel, being very muscular against China. We just have a few minutes, not even a minute, 30 seconds left. Joshua, what will Democrats be focusing on as they hold minority positions in the House and Senate?
Yeah, I mean, it is no surprise that they'll be in a defensive posture. We've seen big swaths of bipartisanship in America in this last couple of years with the bipartisan infrastructure. act where folks kind of came together. But I can tell you right now, if the priorities of a Trump executive and legislative branch are to deport 25 million Americans, of which every official estimation, including the Department of Homeland Security, say that there aren't 25 million, or things like giving cops full qualified immunity, you probably won't see Democrats kind of tapping into that bipartisan posture and leaning more into where they can move on a more economic populist message on getting more jobs and money in the hands of working people.
And Amanda, obviously, slim majority on both sides for the Republicans in the Senate. You have two senators there that could go either way, maybe more, depending on the issue. How can Republicans reach across the aisle as they implement their policy changes?
Well, I mean, they're going to have to. But the bigger issue and the broader issue that you're going to hear more about is the mandate that President Trump has. And with that mandate, even if there are senators that say, well, maybe I wouldn't support some of these nominees, they know that President Trump has a mandate. They know that their constituents voted for President Trump. And so they kind of do have to carry their weight, whether they're Democrat or Republican. They can't just neglect everything that their constituents wanted in what was presented by President Trump. So I think there's always going to be bipartisanship. There's always going to be a working across the aisle with certain senators, certain House members, and certain ones just won't. But the nature of having these slim majorities kind of requires that they work together. But I think the overarching theme is that President Trump has a mandate, and both sides need to be aware of that.
Joshua Doss, Amanda Mackey, thank you both so much for your insights.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Coming up, Democratic governors are forming a new alliance, planning to work together to, quote, protect the foundations of democracy, what it means for Trump. And on Capitol Hill, lawmakers question officials from the CDC and FDA on what they did wrong during the COVID pandemic response.
What are they
and how they
protecting?
continue to prepare for the next emergency. That and more when we return.